the beginning, I've made it clear that the overall coverage of the Western media when it comes to Israel's genocidal onslaught against Gaza, with courageous and commendable exceptions, has been a disgrace. From failing to accurately frame their coverage around Israel's clearly repeatedly stated genocidal intent, as expressed through the numerous statements of its leaders, to whitewashing and ignoring crimes, failing to challenge lies, failing to address the complicity of Western states, treating Israeli spokespeople with deference, failing to listen to Palestinian perspectives, we could go on. The scale of the crime, though, is such that it is impossible to suppress all of the reality, and you do occasionally get genuinely important pieces of journalism which offer us insight into this unfolding and unspeakable horror. One is a new piece of journalism from CNN, which is notable given a study earlier this year based on anonymous briefings by CNN staff accused their own network of journalistic malpractice because of its endemic pro-Israeli bias. Now, it's an article on the CNN website entitled "Strapped Down, Blindfolded, Held in Diapers, Israeli Whistleblowers Detail Abuse of Palestinians in Shadowy Detention Center." It is a hideous read and exposes the barbaric mistreatment of Palestinian detainees by the Israeli state. Now, we're discussing here detainees held at Sder Timon, a military base in the Negev desert in Israel proper, and is based on, in large part, on the testimonies of 3 Israeli whistleblowers who risked legal repercussions and reprisals from Israeli extremists. Now, one says of the detainees, "We were told that they were not allowed to move, they should sit upright, they're not allowed to talk, not allowed to peek under their blindfold. The detainees were almost always blindfolded. There was a putrid smell always in the air because of neglected wounds left to rot. Guards were instructed to scream, 'Uskot,' shut up, in Arabic, and told to pick out people who were deemed problematic and punish them." They said, these whistleblowers, that doctors sometimes amputated prisoners' limbs because of injuries sustained by constant handcuffing, while medical procedures were sometimes performed by underqualified medics. Detainees were placed under extreme physical restraints, they say, with wounded detainees strapped to their beds wearing diapers and fed through straws. One whistleblower, who worked as a medic at the facility's field hospital, according to CNN, says they stripped them down of anything that resembles human beings. They report another whistleblower who says the beatings were not done to gather intelligence. They were done out of revenge for what they, the Palestinians, did on October 7th and punishment for behaviour in the camp. Now, responding to the CNN's request for comment, the Israeli military deny all this. They say, they ensure proper conduct towards detainees. Allegations of misconduct by IDF soldiers is examined and dealt with accordingly. A load of nonsense. I mean, we can see over and over again throughout this horror these terrible atrocities being committed and bragged about, I have to say, by IDF soldiers with no disciplinary action taken against them. Now, as the article says, these testimonies cast more doubt on the Israeli government's repeated assertions that it acts in accordance with accepted international practice and law. So what happens, as the piece explains, is that in this so-called war, the Israeli military are allowed to detain people there for 45 days before they're transferred to the former prison system, where over 9,000 detainees are held in conditions human rights groups have said have drastically deteriorated since 7th of October. And I'll try and do more on that because, I mean, we're looking there at horrors in that prison system. But I'll have something to talk about here, actually. 18 Palestinians have reportedly died in Israeli custody since all this began, including the leading Gaza surgeon, Dr. Adnan al-Bursh. Now, let's just be blunt here. These people aren't just dying in detention. I mean, I don't think you're stupid or naive. It's obvious they're being killed either in deliberate specific incidents or because of the effects of sustained mistreatment, torture. CNN also interviewed a dozen former Palestinian detainees who said they couldn't work out where they'd been held because they were largely blindfolded and cut off from the world. But what they said tallied with the accounts of whistleblowers. They spoke of being held in desert conditions, so obviously unpleasant heat in the day, but then cold at night. One detainee, Dr. Mohammed Al-Ran, who headed the surgical unit at the Indonesian hospital in Gaza, and bear in mind, so many medics have been detained by the Israeli state as they've destroyed the medical system in Gaza. He said he was stripped to his underwear, blindfolded, his wrist tied, then dumped on the back of a truck where near naked detainees were piled on top of one another. Israeli whistleblowers in this piece also say that they appoint a so-called supervisor, or swarish in Arabic, as they're detainees who are cleared of suspected links to Hamas after interrogation. So that means they keep people who can't be accused of being guilty of anything. Now, the Israeli authorities again deny that, but again, who are you going to believe here? In the case of Dr. Mohammed Al-Ran, that meant in his case, being kept there after being cleared for weeks. He was given what he describes as a special privilege, his blindfold being removed, but that meant being forced to see others being tortured and treated as animals. So that imposed a horror in its own right. Now, prisoners who committed offences like speaking to one another would be forced to keep their arms above their heads for an hour. But if a detainee, a prisoner, a hostage, if you want to call them that, if they moved or spoke more than once, they'd be beaten, including to the point of their bones being broken. It spoke about these routine searches where guards would unleash large dogs on sleeping detainees, throw in sound grenades as troops barged in, and the dogs then climbing all over them. Obviously a completely terrifying experience. One whistleblower said he was forced to perform medical procedures he wasn't qualified for. He said just being there felt like being complicit in abuse. We've seen in pictures of those detainees being released how emaciated and badly treated they've been. Now, again, the Israeli authorities deny this, but who do you believe? Authorities with a track record of lying through their teeth, or multiple Israeli whistleblowers, which corroborate the testimonies of countless Palestinian detainees. The point here is Israel is routinely and flagrantly violating international law every single day in multiple ways, and its Western allies know it. Now, as Omar Shakir, the Israel and Palestine director at Human Rights Watch, correctly puts it, what we know about Gaza is only the tip of an atrocity iceberg. We already know before 7th of October of hideous mistreatment of detainees. Important because this attempt to start the clock on 7th of October is a disgrace. It is a complete flagrant, shows flagrant contempt for the truth and reality. Now, specifically in the West Bank, where huge numbers of Palestinians are arrested and detained without charge, including children. As Save the Children found in a report before the 7th of October, months before 7th of October, focusing on child detainees, Palestinian children, we're talking about children here, just to be clear, in the Israeli military detention system face physical and emotional abuse, with 4 out of 5, 86% of them being beaten, 69% strip searched, nearly half, 42%, injured at the point of arrest, including gunshot wounds and broken bones. Some report violence of a sexual nature. Some are transferred to court or between detention centres and small cages. Now, they report, Save the Children, that 42% of them, again, before 7th of October, detained by Israel, were injured, including gunshot wounds and broken bones. 65% arrested during the night, 86% beaten, 70% threatened with harm, 60% hit with sticks and guns. Some children reporting violence and abuse of a sexual nature. Children, remember that, talking about children. Now, we know in February that the UN reported sexual and physical violence against Palestinian women. And this is truly gruesome. And I would note that these Palestinian women have been erased completely, haven't they? How often is this discussed? At least 2 female Palestinian detainees were reportedly raped, according to the UN report, while others were reportedly threatened with rape and sexual violence. They also noted that photos of female detainees in degrading circumstances were reportedly taken by the Israeli army and uploaded online. Furthermore, Palestinian women and girls have reportedly been arbitrarily executed in Gaza, often together with family members, including their children, according to information received. Hundreds of Palestinian women and girls have reportedly been subjected to inhuman and degrading treatment, denied menstruation pads, food and medicine, and severely beaten. On at least one occasion, Palestinian women detained in Gaza were allegedly kept in a cage in the rain and cold without food. Now, according to the NGO Euromed Human Rights Monitor, Palestinian prisoners and detainees from the Gaza Strip who are being held by the Israeli army are being subjected to premeditated murder and arbitrary execution outside of the purview of the law and the judiciary. They add that the Israeli army continues to commit the crime of forced disappearance of prisoners and detainees from the Gaza Strip by withholding lists of their names and information about their whereabouts. Sounds a lot like hostage taking to me. Now, there's a report compiled by UNRWA, that's the United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees, the main humanitarian agency in Gaza, which Israel has waged a vicious war against. Back in March, it was estimated by them that more than 4,000 men, women and children have been rounded up in Gaza since this began. Now, when we talking about children, we're talking about kids as young as 6 years old detained in these conditions, as well as elderly Palestinians with chronic conditions like Alzheimer's, placed in makeshift military barracks housing 100 to 122 people each, where they could be held for weeks at a time. The report says methods of ill treatment reported included physical beatings, forced stress positions for extended periods of time, threats of harm to detainees and their families, attacks by dogs, insults to personal dignity and humiliation, such as being made to act like animals or getting urinated on, use of loud music and noises, deprivation of water, food, sleep and toilets, denial of the right to practice their religion, to pray, and prolonged use of tightly locked handcuffs causing open wounds and friction injuries. Women detainees reported being groped while blindfolded, and some male prisoners said they were beaten in their genitals. According to the UNRWA report, another detainee reported being made to sit on an electrical probe causing burns to his anus, the scars for which could still be seen weeks later. He indicated that another detainee had also suffered the same treatment and died as a result of his infected wounds. Again, denied by the Israeli authorities. Who do you believe here? With their track record of deception. So many testimonies. The fact is, these aren't lies, clearly, are they? What we're hearing here is the tip of an iceberg. It's just not at all clear. We're just not at all clear about the vast reality of the horrors. Because, you know, they've overseen the biggest killing of journalists in recorded history. They're blocking foreign journalists from getting in. It's just very difficult to know in terms of, obviously, get information from, well, those who were detained and those who have been killed. We just don't know the full scale of this horror. But we know enough. We know enough for there to be no excuse. We know that terrible, terrible atrocities are being committed. Now, let's just be clear here. When Hamas took civilians hostages on the 7th of October, that wasn't a terrible war crime. We need to be clear, morally consistent about this. Always try to be morally consistent. You know, moral clarity, very important. I would note that the horrors imposed on Palestinian detainees as evidence throughout all of these pieces of evidence are much, much worse than the evidence we currently have about Israeli hostages, a point previously put to me in an interview, I'll say, by the courageous Israeli journalist Gideon Levy. In fact, some of the evidence suggests that the main horror, that, again, not to belittle, again, the horror in its own right of being held hostage, that is a horror, not going to belittle that, but the biggest fear was of Israeli bombardment of the Gaza Strip, which has clearly killed a significant number of Israeli hostages, it must be said. And we know, anyway, that Israel has killed far more of its own hostages than it's rescued by military means. And we should regard these Palestinian detainees as hostages, clearly. I mean, look, we're talking about kids as young as 6 here. Now, when discussing the horrors unleashed by the Israeli state with the full complicity of the Western governments, it is often, I know, to know where do we start, where do we end. Here is one horror, one particular horror. But here's a prediction. The Israeli state subjecting so many to terrible mistreatment and torture will simply radicalise many of them if they survive, but as well as radicalising their loved ones, as well as radicalising those who learn of what Israel has done. But Israel has become so overwhelmed by this racist and genocidal mania that it can't even grasp this desperately obvious point as it subjects the Palestinian people to this unforgivable horror. Well, we will continue, as best we can, certainly on this channel, to discuss the horrors being unleashed by the Israeli state and to give a platform as best we can to the experiences, the lived experiences of the Palestinian people in one of the great atrocities of our age. Please like and subscribe. Do leave a comment. I always read through your comments, including the abusive ones. Do share this video and help us take on the Pro War Media at patreon.com/OwnJones84. Listen to the podcast. I'll speak to you soon.